Hi, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 9, which covers monopoly. So last chapter we started our discussion of market structures by looking at perfect competition. Now we're going to continue by looking at a new market structure. And this is a monopolized market, or a market that has a single seller. So first, here's our definition of what a monopoly is. A monopoly occurs when we have a single seller that's producing some unique product that has no close substitutes. And additionally, this seller is able to prevent new firms from entering their market. So clearly a monopoly is different than a perfectly competitive market because now we just have one seller. They're selling some unique product, something that no other seller is able to provide, and they're able to prevent new firms from entering their market. So what this means is that we have some barriers to entry in this market. There exists some kind of regulations or some kind of restriction that prevents new firms from entering the market and makes it so that the monopoly doesn't have to compete with any other firms. So when we have a single seller selling a unique product and they don't have to compete with any other firms due to these barriers to entry, we say that that firm has monopoly power. Because consumers can't get this product anywhere else, this firm is going to be able to control the price of its good or service. The key factor here is that a monopoly can charge its own price and is able to be this unique seller for a product because some barriers to entry must exist. So these barriers to entry are how monopolies actually form. Now, all a barrier to entry is it's some restriction that makes it difficult for new firms to enter this specific market where the monopoly is operating. Now, these barriers to entry can either be natural or they can be created by some government regulation. First, let's talk about 3 types of natural barriers to entry that can allow a monopoly to form. First is going to be the control of resources. If one single firm owns most or all of the resources that are needed to produce some special product, then that firm is going to be able to control the market and maintain its status as a monopoly. So if you operate a business and you control a scarce resource, then your competitors aren't going to be able to find enough of that resource to produce and compete with you. An example of this that we hear about a lot is that Chinese corporations own about 70% of the rare metals that are needed to produce a lot of electronics. So these Chinese corporations operate as a monopoly in these electronics markets. They control the resources, so they control the production. Our second natural barrier can be problems raising capital for these smaller firms that are trying to compete with a monopoly. A lot of the monopolies that we see in the real world today are very, very large corporations, or they are very well-established corporations that have been running for a very long time. When new firms are trying to enter the market to compete with a really big, really old firm, they might face problems in trying to generate enough investment, enough capital to actually compete with that big business. Investors might say, hey, I'd rather invest in this big, safe, trustworthy firm than invest in your small startup that might go under. So potential competitors might not be able to raise enough money to compete with a monopoly. Our last natural barrier is what we call economies of scale. And so we've already talked about economies of scale in our chapter on production and costs. So keep in mind that economies of scale exist when, for some specific firm or industry, the average total cost to produce or the cost per unit falls as that business grows larger and larger, or as it produces more and more output. So when economies of scale are present in a specific market, this means that it's going to be way cheaper for one big firm to supply the entire market than it would be for a bunch of small firms to generate supply from the market. If economies of scale exist in a certain industry, and because of that a monopoly is present in the market, then we're going to call this a natural monopoly. We call it a natural monopoly simply because the cost structure of this industry just naturally lends itself to generating a monopoly. It's cheaper to let one big business produce this product than to have a bunch of small businesses produce it. So this monopoly is just going to occur on its own. A common example of a natural monopoly that we see is utility services. So think about the way that you get electricity supplied to your house. If you're in Southern California, you probably go through SoCal Edison. And you don't have any other choices, right? Depending on where you live, there's usually just one company that is supplying electricity to your entire city. This is because of economies of scale. It's a lot cheaper to have one company lay all of the electrical lines that go to everybody's houses and to all of our businesses than to have a bunch of different companies all lay their own sets of electrical lines and then give consumers the choice for which company they want to go with. It's cheaper to just create one set of lines, so it's going to be cheaper to have one large monopoly supply electricity. In other cases, a monopoly forms because the government creates some kind of barrier to entry for potential competing firms. So this usually happens in one of two ways. The first is through some kind of intellectual property law, and the second is through licensing or creating a legal monopoly. Now, we have a couple examples of intellectual property here: patent, trademark, and copyright, and each of these legal protections serve a different purpose. So a patent is offered to the inventor of some product or service, and it gives them the exclusive legal right to sell their invention for 20 years from the date that they file the patent. So what a patent is designed to do is it's designed to promote innovation. Those that innovate and create some new product are rewarded with this monopoly power for a set period of time, where they will not have to face any competitors. We see these monopoly patents a lot in the pharmaceutical industry. When a pharmaceutical company creates a new medication, it will file a patent on that medication, and then it will have the exclusive right to sell it for a set number of years. Some common examples of this are Lipitor, the cholesterol medication, the EpiPen, or the epinephrine shot for people that have serious allergic reactions, and even some of these weight loss drugs like GLP-1s, Ozempic, Wegovy, whatever. So, because pharmaceutical companies can gain this right to be the only one to sell a drug for 20 years, that incentivizes them to create new medications. So there's a good thing that's created by the patent, it promotes innovation, but that patent protection over the life of the patent makes it so that the drug costs more for consumers and that less of that drug is available in the market. Once the patent expires, anybody can go out and they can sell that same product. So this is when we start to see generic versions of medications be produced and sold. A trademark offers protection for a firm on its branding. So this can be an identifying logo or symbol or font that protects the business so that it's the only one that's able to use this branding. And this can give firms a little bit of monopoly power. If Chevrolet is the only company that can use the Chevy logo, then they're really the only ones who can sell a product that is going to be signaled to consumers as a Chevy. I can't make a car in my garage and slap the Chevy logo on it and try to sell it as a Chevy. So this does protect the firm from being the only one that's able to sell a product under their unique branding. A copyright is kind of like a patent, except it's protecting what the US government defines as original works of authorship. So this includes literature, drama, music, film, television, things like that. So if I write a song, I can copyright that song, and then I'm the only one who's allowed to produce that music and sell it. Typically, a copyright lasts for the lifetime of the author plus 70 years. Finally, the last barrier to entry that we want to talk about doesn't fit into either of the two previous categories. It's not a natural barrier, and it's not a government-created barrier. Instead, what predatory pricing is it's an attempt to intimidate potential competitors. So if a firm is using predatory pricing, this means that it's threatening other businesses with really sharp price cuts to discourage them from entering this industry and competing with them. So a company that has been, kind of accused of doing this is Walmart. So Walmart is a really big business and it's able to supply a lot of products for very, very low prices. And these prices may be so low that their competitors, small mom and pop stores, can't compete with them. And so what Walmart has been accused of doing is entering an industry, building a new location of their store, and setting prices really, really low so that none of their competitors can afford to stay in business and compete with them, and they all shut down. Then, once those competitors shut down, Walmart has been accused of raising its prices so that it can increase its revenue. So when we think about predatory pricing, we want to think about our profit formula. If Walmart is a really big business, they might be able to afford, in the short run, lowering their prices below average total cost for a small period of time. Again, because they're a big business, they might be able to sustain this. But some smaller competitors might not be able to hang on if Walmart is dropping the price in this market really, really low and forcing these other businesses to incur losses. Now that we know what a monopoly is and how it might form, we want to talk about what goes on with the output and pricing decisions when a monopoly is trying to maximize its profits. First, in order to do this, we need to think about the demand that a monopoly faces compared to the demand that a perfectly competitive firm faces. So we want to think back to the market structure of perfect competition. Under perfect competition, we have a whole bunch of firms, they're all relatively small, and they're selling an identical product. And because of that, these competitive firms are price takers. So the demand curve that a perfectly competitive firm perceives, or its individual demand curve, is going to be completely flat. It's going to be a horizontal line. So I'm going to call this DC for my demand curve for competitive firm. And this demand curve is going to be horizontal at the prevailing market price or the equilibrium price. For our perfectly competitive firm, they either choose to sell at the market price or they don't sell at all. If they're willing to sell at this market price, they can pretty much sell whatever quantity of output they want to. Now, the difference here is that for a monopoly, they're the only firm that is supplying any product in this market. And because of this, our monopolist faces the entire market demand curve. So the demand curve that our monopolist is going to perceive is going to be downward sloping, our kind of normal market demand curve that we've talked about in this class. And so when a monopolist varies its quantity of output, it in turn is varying the price for that product. Or we can think of it the other way, the monopolist sets the price, and then consumers decide how much they want to buy. So because we have these two different demand curves, we're going to have a very different picture when it comes to marginal revenue and profit maximization for a monopoly than we did for a perfectly competitive firm. All right, so because our monopoly faces this downward sloping market demand curve, we can use this to talk about total revenue and then marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is what we're after, so we can talk about profit maximization. So here's a graph of my demand curve for a monopoly, and let's say that right now my monopoly is charging price P1, and so its consumers want to buy quantity Q1. If I want to measure my monopoly's total revenue when it's charging P1 and selling Q1, I'm just looking for the area of this rectangle, right? Whenever I want to find my firm's total revenue, or R, I'm just going to take price times quantity. So this rectangle here is going to be my firm's total revenue when it's operating at this point A. Now, let's see what happens when the monopoly starts to lower the price. Let's say that now it wants to charge price P2. Before we even see what new quantity my firm is going to sell, it's losing out on some revenue, right? Because it dropped the price from P1 to P2, for this original Q1 quantity of output that it was selling, it's losing this chunk of revenue right here. It's selling each unit that it was going to sell before for a lower price. But it's not all bad, right? Because by dropping the price, according to the law of demand, quantity demanded is going to go up. So when our firm drops the price, yes, it sells each unit for less, but it's also able to sell to more customers. And so because of that, it also gains some revenue that's shown by this area. And so when a monopoly is changing its price, it faces these two kind of opposite effects. There's the price effect, the revenue that they lose from dropping the price, and there's the output effect, the revenue that they gain from being able to sell to more customers at a lower price. And so my monopoly's marginal revenue is not going to be constant. Sometimes they might lose more revenue than they gain by dropping the price. Sometimes they might gain more revenue than they lose by dropping the price. And so because of this, our marginal revenue curve is actually going to be downward sloping. When the firm is originally charging a really, really high price, as it lowers the price, that output effect, that increase in sales is going to outweigh the price effect. But eventually, as they start to drop the price lower and lower and lower, that price effect is going to outweigh the output effect. The fact that they're selling each unit for less is going to overpower the gains in revenue from selling to more customers. So marginal revenue is going to start out high, and then it's going to decrease as the firm starts to lower the price. So our monopoly faces this downward sloping marginal revenue curve. And the marginal revenue curve is always going to fall below the demand curve. And this is because the highest price my monopoly can possibly charge is determined by my demand curve. As my firm starts to lower the price, its marginal revenue is gradually going to fall as that price effect, selling each unit for less, starts to outweigh the output effect, selling to more customers. All right, now we're all ready to talk about how a monopoly is going to choose the level of output and the price that maximizes its profit. So remember, a monopoly is not a price taker, it's a price maker. Because it's selling that unique product and it doesn't have to compete with any other firms, it has full control over the quantity supplied in the market, and therefore it has influence over the price that it charges. So I've added to our graph a marginal cost curve. Just like for our perfectly competitive firms, our monopoly is going to face this kind of upward sloping marginal cost curve. As output increases, the marginal cost to produce will increase as the monopoly exhausts those benefits from specialization and the division of labor. So the first part of this profit maximization problem is going to be exactly the same as it was under perfect competition. So first, our monopoly is going to find the level of output where its marginal revenue is equal to its marginal cost. That is going to tell it what quantity it should produce. So for my monopoly here, it's going to want to produce at this level of output where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so let's call this Q star. Now, our monopolist wants to make as much money as it can, right? So it wants to set the price based on what its consumers are willing to pay. So it's going to set the price based on the demand curve. And this is where things differ from perfect competition. Under perfect competition, our firms were price takers, and they would set the price equal to marginal revenue and marginal cost. Our monopolist is going to choose to set a higher price. So they're going to find out which price on the demand curve is associated with this quantity of output, and that's going to be the price that they charge for their product. All right, now if we start adding in some cost curves, we can actually calculate the amount of profit that our monopoly earns when it makes this profit maximizing decision about its level of output and its price. So I've added in this average total cost curve here, and I've written our profit formula here for our reference. So that we can do a practice problem, instead of just calling these Q star and P star, let's use some real numbers. So let's say that my monopolist has a profit maximizing level of output of 80 units, and that the price that it's going to charge per unit is $10. In order for us to figure out how much profit the monopoly is actually going to earn, we also need to know how much it costs to produce each unit of output. So we need to say, okay, my firm is going to produce 80 units of output. What is the average total cost associated with producing this quantity? And that's going to be given by wherever this quantity hits my average total cost curve and the price or the cost that is associated with that. And so let's say that this is $8. So my firm is making 80 units of output, it's charging $10 per unit, and it's costing $8 per unit to produce. So my profit is going to be the area on my graph that is getting trapped between my price, my average total cost, bounded by the quantity that my monopoly is producing. So let's use our profit formula and see how much this monopoly is actually making. My price is $10. I subtract from that my average total cost of $8, and I multiply that by the quantity being sold, which is 80. So the profit that my monopoly is earning is 10 minus 8, which is 2. So I have $2 times 80 units of output. So my monopoly is earning $160 in profit. So a monopoly is also going to follow the same operation or shutdown condition as a perfectly competitive firm does. As long as price is greater than average total cost, the monopoly is making a positive profit. If price falls below average total cost, then the monopoly is operating at a loss, and depending on whether we're in the short run or the long run, it's going to make its decision about continuing to operate at that loss, or shutting down or exiting the industry entirely. So please go back and review our video on perfect competition to review those shutdown rules. Essentially, for a monopoly, as long as the average total cost curve is sitting below the demand curve, they're going to be okay, they're going to make some positive profit. So if this is where my firm's average total cost curve was, now when it produces 80 units of output, its cost is way up here above the price that it earns. And so in this situation, my monopoly would actually be incurring a loss or a negative profit. All right, the last thing we want to do here is compare this market outcome under monopoly to our efficient outcome that we had under perfect competition. So a perfectly competitive market is efficient because total surplus is maximized. But under a monopoly, we have a different story. So for our monopolist, they're going to choose to operate at the level of output where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and they're going to set the price based on the demand curve. But this is not what happens under perfect competition. If our monopoly was to behave the way that a perfectly competitive firm would, it would actually be choosing to produce at this point here, where marginal cost is equal to price. And so that is because of this profit maximizing condition that we had under perfect competition, where price, marginal revenue, and marginal cost should all be equal. So this green marginal revenue curve, this is my monopolist marginal revenue curve. So right now, we're assuming that this firm is going to behave like a perfectly competitive firm, so it would have that horizontal marginal revenue curve, and it's going to operate at the point where price is equal to marginal cost. So that would make our firm produce at this quantity here, which I'm going to mark as QC for quantity under competition, and it would charge this price, which we'll call PC for our perfectly competitive price. So this is what would happen if we were in a perfectly competitive market, or if our monopoly was choosing to be nice and friendly and behave like a perfectly competitive firm. But we know this is not what the monopoly wants to do. It wants to maximize profit, so it wants to produce at this point here and produce this quantity of output, which I'll call QM for Q under monopoly. Then it's going to set its price based on the demand curve. So it's going to charge this price, PM. And so what we see under monopoly is that we have this inefficiency. The monopoly is going to produce less output than a perfectly competitive market would, and it's going to charge a higher price. So because of this, we say that we have a market failure, or we have some loss in efficiency and some loss in welfare. So a monopoly is actually generating a deadweight loss. Because we're losing some economic activity, we have fewer units of output that are being produced and sold. This area here, this little triangle, represents the deadweight loss generated by our monopoly. And so we often use the term allocative inefficiency here. Compared to this socially optimal, perfectly competitive market, our monopoly produces less and charges our consumers more. So not only does a monopoly produce this inefficient market outcome, where less output is produced and it's sold at a higher price, it also harms consumers in other ways. So under monopoly, consumers usually have fewer choices than they would in a perfectly competitive market. This is because the monopoly has control, they're selling this unique product, and they will often force consumers to buy bundles of goods just to get the one thing that they want. So think about streaming services or cable TV. If you want to watch just one show on Hulu and you don't care about all the other shows that are on there, you still have to subscribe to all of Hulu just to get permission to watch the one show that you care about. So Hulu kind of acts like a monopoly, and they force you to buy this bundle of goods so that you can get access to the one thing that you actually wanted. So as a consumer, you have less choice under monopoly. Another problem with monopoly is that firms can often waste a whole lot of resources just trying to compete to get this monopoly power. And economists really don't like this. They call this rent seeking. So what rent seeking is it's when firms waste time, money, resources trying to become a monopoly instead of using all of those resources to be more efficient or to produce a better product for the market. So instead of making some new innovation or improving their production process, they spend all their time and money just grasping for power and to control the price and market. So what can the government do to reduce this monopoly power and improve outcomes for consumers? First, the government can try to improve competition. They can do this by breaking up a monopoly into a bunch of smaller firms through something that we call antitrust law. But this doesn't always work because sometimes the government breaks up a monopoly into a bunch of small firms, but those small firms still cooperate with one another and kind of behave like a monopoly or like one big firm anyways. Or the government will break up a monopoly and then eventually over time those firms merge back together. This happened with AT&T, which was broken up into a bunch of baby bell firms in 1984, but if we think about AT&T today, we still see it as a very large business. Another way that the government can encourage competition is by reducing barriers to trade. So this will help to reduce the monopoly power that a domestic firm has by exposing it to international competition. If we reduce barriers such as tariffs, then our domestic firms will be forced to compete with international suppliers, and this increased competition from foreign firms will make the market more competitive and sort of dilute this monopoly power that a domestic firm might have. Lastly, the government can implement something that we call price regulation. And this is simply where they step into the market and they force the monopoly to charge a lower price for their product. So the government does this through a price ceiling. We would call a price regulation optimal if it forces the monopoly to behave like a perfectly competitive firm. So if the government implements optimal price regulation, they would force the monopoly to charge a price equal to their marginal cost. Sometimes this perfect price regulation isn't possible though, and so the government might try and get the monopoly to reduce its price, but maybe not lower it all the way down to its marginal cost. In practice, it can be very difficult for the government to implement price regulation because the government probably doesn't know what costs actually look like for a monopoly. And the monopoly certainly doesn't want to give that information up. So this might encourage a monopoly to lie about its costs and inflate its costs so that when the government implements this kind of price regulation, the price doesn't fall all that much. Additionally, when the government implements price regulation on a natural monopoly, this could actually force the natural monopoly to operate at a loss. And this is because a monopoly's average total cost might sit above its marginal cost, and so the monopoly would be earning negative profits. Sometimes the government will provide subsidies to offset this, but still, it makes this pricing regulation very difficult to implement. All right, that's it for today. I'll see you guys in the next one.